All right, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Angela Giacchetti, and I'm the Open Mobility Foundation's Member Engagement Manager. It's so good to be here with you all. So nice to see some familiar faces and have some new folks on the line as well. So today is the first in our equity event series. Um, I'm going to get us started with just a really quick introduction and go over some logistics while more folks join the webinar. Um, so first off, for those who are new to the Open Mobility Foundation, the OMF is a nonprofit that develops tools for cities to manage mobility. Primarily, we develop a tool called the Mobility Data Specification, or MDS for short. We're also undertaking work in the curb management space right now, and we have plans to release a curb data specification later this year. I'm not going to get too far into our work, but you can learn more about it on our website, and I'll also be sharing some ways to stay in touch in a bit. The OMF is a membership organization, and we bring together public agencies and private sector stakeholders to create the tools that we create in an open source environment. So that means that what we build is freely available and developed through a transparent collaborative process. Over 25 cities and transit organizations are members, as well as multiple private sector companies in the mobility space. We also get support from foundations like Rockefeller and Knight. But ultimately, we're a community of practitioners. And while the day-to-day work that we do can be quite wonky, admittedly, it's also mission-driven. We're interested in aligning data with policy goals to ensure or work toward a mobility ecosystem where all folks can get their transport needs met in safer, more equitable, and environmentally sustainable ways. And from time to time, in order to fulfill this mission, we convene experts to guide our work and inform our members. So today, we're going to hear from an amazing panel of experts on how cities and companies can move the needle toward a more equitable transportation ecosystem, and what kind of metrics and methodologies can be used to achieve and measure desired outcomes. So I'll take a beat here to really underscore that equity is a multifaceted issue, one that we will be addressing more broadly in this panel, in this conversation. But we really look forward to hearing feedback from the community around some of the specific barriers to access and some of the kind of unique equity related issues that you'd like to discuss in more detail as we continue to focus on the topic. Before I introduce the panelists, some things to note. This is my little logistics spiel. This webinar is being recorded and a video will be made available after the event. The event will close with Q&A from you, the audience. So if you have questions at any time, there's a little Q&A feature on Zoom. Feel free to use that. You'll be able to ask questions anonymously. And our intention is to really make this a welcoming environment for discussion. And we've also used the questions from the registration form to inform the panel discussion. Thank you so much for submitting them. They were great questions, and we'll seek to get to more of those in the Q&A that are not addressed in the panel discussion, if time permits. So on that note, we might not get to all the questions today, given the brevity of this event and the depth of the topic, but I really hope you'll stay in touch with us as we share additional resources and responses. On that note, this is the first in a two-part series of events. Our next event will be held on October 6th and will be focused on case studies from OMF members, where our members will dive a little bit deeper into the specifics around MDS in particular and other tools that cities can and companies can use to create, measure, and advance equity initiatives. So we'll share a link for sign up along with the recording as a follow-up to this event. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's panel so that they can get started. I'll caveat this intro by saying that I'm really thrilled to have this group and highly encourage you to look up their full bios and all of the research and other projects that they've been involved with, because it will certainly help inspire you and deepen your own work on the kind of intersection of data, equity, and mobility. Moderating our panel today is Sam Jackson, who serves as the co-chair of the OMF Strategy Committee and is also involved with product and partnerships at Lacuna Technologies. He is responsible for developing technology and business partnerships across the mobility landscape to help Lacuna and its partners better realize the future of urban movement. He's long been involved with the Mobility Data Specification, or MDS, and the Open Mobility Foundation, and we're super thankful to him and our strategy committee for helping to make this event series come to life. Joining Sam on the panel is Dr. Stefanie Brodie. Stefanie is Toole Design's research practice lead and a researcher who specializes in transportation planning and policy. She's worked on several projects that align equity and new mobility, including developing a methodology for LADOT's micromobility pilots equity evaluation, as well as helping San Jose to create an emerging mobility plan that centers racial equity. Prior to joining Toole Design, Stefanie served as a research program specialist for Washington, D.C.'s District Department of Transportation. She also has an extensive research background, and her published works cover topics of transportation equity, performance-based planning, sustainability, and environmental justice. Next joining us is Sarah M. Kaufman. Sarah is the Associate Director of the NYU Rudin Center for Transportation Policy and Management, where she's researched and educated about cutting-edge technologies in transportation for nearly 10 years. She is also an adjunct professor of planning, teaching intelligent cities and advanced projects in urban planning. Sarah has directed several research projects related to transportation and public health, gender, and access. Plus, she directs the Emerging Leaders in Transportation Fellowship, which is an annual program to enhance innovation in transportation planning and policymaking. And finally, we are joined by Waffiyyah Murray. Waffiyyah is a nationally recognized expert in transportation equity with a background in nonprofit leadership and youth development. She's presented at several national conferences and provided technical assistance to numerous bike share and micromobility systems, working to incorporate equity within their work. As the education program manager for the Bicycle Coalition of Greater Philadelphia, she coordinated its Safe Route to School program, which is a national initiative promoting safety and physical activity in school-aged children through walking and biking. In her current role as the Better Bike Share Partnership program manager for the city of Philadelphia, Waffiyyah works to address barriers to the use of bike share for individuals with low income and BIPOC communities, while increasing equitable access in micromobility systems worldwide. So let's give a virtual round of applause to our panel. Feel free to use the chat for any non-question related conversation, emoji applause, etc. And you can ask questions using the Q&A button below at any time, and I'll hand it over to Sam.
Thanks, Angela. Everybody can still hear me? Perfect. Well, let's launch right in. So thank you to our panelists for being here. And I thought maybe at the beginning, we might set out a little bit, well, where are we trying to go? And so I wanted to read one line that I thought talked about transportation equity in a compelling way. This was from Changing Lanes, a report that Toole was involved with in LA, saying, transportation is not just a matter of networks and infrastructure, it is more accurately a critical means of self-determination. And therefore, inequitable access to transportation has profound consequences that affect quality of life across many metrics. So that's a good point, but there's a lot of still nuance in what transportation equity means. So maybe real briefly to warm us up from each of the panelists, what do you mean when you think about transportation equity? How should we be defining this subject to begin with? Maybe Stefanie, you're to my left.
Hi, thank you. I'm so excited to be on this panel and to talk with you all today. I guess at the basis of when I'm thinking about transportation equity, I'm really thinking about how do we minimize the difference between those that are highly benefited by the transportation system and those who are facing burdens and are not receiving those benefits. So really providing a system that allows all people, regardless of demographics and ability, to engage with society and to get to the places they need to go and get the services and goods they need. So it's kind of really a basic explanation, a basic definition, and that's how I typically think about transportation equity.
Any Go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say very similar to what Stefanie just shared. And say if you're working to incorporate equitable transportation, you should have a system that is accessible to any and everyone, regardless of ability or et cetera, and that you should be working to address any barriers that could possibly come up, preventing that access, whether it be affordability, health, resource, et cetera. So making sure that it's accessible to everyone and that you're working to alleviate any potential barriers that may block someone from being able to use the system effectively.
I agree with both of what you said, and I would add on the representation at the leadership level of a variety of users of transportation, people who use the system, engage with it in different ways, and that's a key to providing more equitable service, is having real system users from all different backgrounds and experiences represented and being able to scope the future work of the organizations.
And if we're building on that, I think we could all, most of the audience here today as well, would agree that the transportation system is not as equitable as we would want it to be, that there's room for improvement. So we don't probably have to argue that point. But a question would be, well, where could we get and how fast could we get there? If we set ourselves a time horizon of maybe, let's say, 3 years, 5 years, what would be a really big change that some of you might want to see? Like, what would success look like? And then we can talk throughout the rest of our discussion about how we get there. But although we might not completely transform everything in 5 years, we could potentially do more than we think. Any perspectives on what might be a really ambitious target in that time frame? Maybe Sarah, if you have a thought first.
Sure, thanks. I think one key area to explore within the near future is to, and I think that the audience today could be especially useful in this category, is adding more nuance to data that's collected and used. For example, a lot of our transportation planning relies on census data, which doesn't carry a lot of nuance. For example, if you're picking up children at school and then heading to the grocery store, does that trip count as childcare or does it count as errands? And there isn't a lot of differentiation, and it doesn't show how people actually live. There isn't really enough breakdown in terms of gender, ethnicity, languages spoken in terms of transportation data. And that really harms planning, because then we don't know who's able to use the system adequately and in what ways. So in the time frame that you provided, I would like to see a well-established data standard that accounts for more of these nuances in how people actually travel.
Other thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just going to add on, we're talking about census data and the demographic, I guess the geographic scale that census data allows us to understand the communities at, which is not really granular enough to understand things like safety and kind of like a block to block impact on people and really understanding their lived experience. So when it comes to doing equity analyses, and basing, the census data is really our best source for demographic data. So we're basing our equity analysis on the census data that doesn't really allow us to drill deep enough. So I just wanted to add on to that point.
Yeah, and I would just add, so I know there's often a lot of, focus on like, what can we implement right now to, make changes to the system, make it equitable. But I think before the implementation happens, there's a lot of acknowledgement of why the system is the way it is, why there are inequities that are currently in play, understanding that a lot of it stems from, race, discrimination, systems that were and still are in place that were built to separate as opposed to bring people together. And so it's important to first acknowledge, the role that race and other things play within the inequities of the transportation system, acknowledge that history, and then work with, community members, constituent people, to the people that we're actually looking to serve through these transportation systems, to build back that trust. Because a lot of times people talk about, oh, we want to implement this program, we want to do this because we want to get it done, but there's a lot of mistrust, there's a lot of historic things that have gone wrong for years, and you got to take a step back, right? You have to, figure out where you've been, figure out and understand why these systems are in place, understand why there can be a lot of resistance from a lot of communities when we're looking to implement plans, because, there's a lot of mistrust, there's a lot of harm. So there needs to be space and time available to right those wrongs, rebuild that trust, build those relationships, and then collectively work together with communities and residents and constituents to help, start a new path forward. Once you do that, then you can go into like, okay, what programs can we implement to help address X, Y, and Z?
Well, pivoting from the future to the really present, and looking at the audience list, I know this was a problem or a challenge that a lot of practitioners dealt with. At the start of the pandemic, many cities made choices about whether or not to close streets. So to provide access to the outdoors, or to give businesses a lifeline if they couldn't have indoor dining, etc. And there was a lot of question at the time about what was the right decision to make. Which streets should be closed? How much should the streets be closed? When should they be reopened? And who does that affect? And that was the case where those decisions had to be made quickly and didn't always have the data that they wanted. So throwing it out to the panel, are there examples of how that was done well, places that you thought it could have been done better, or just any comments and questions to that whole situation? Because I know it was something that a lot of folks struggled with. Maybe Stefanie, if I was going to pick on somebody.
Well, one of the responses that I wanted to give to this question is, I think this highlights an issue that is kind of across the board, in that not having an engagement process set up, that you're like continually talking with community and you understand the needs and the issues that they're facing across the board. And then when it comes time to, need to plan something or need to do some sort of rapid implementation, you don't have that communication with the people who you're trying to support. So I think one of the ways that we can adjust for that is by not just engaging when it's time to do the project, or not just engaging when we have an idea that we want to implement, or when it's time to do the long range plan, but having ongoing engagement. And one of the things I do want to talk about too during this conversation is the need for qualitative data. So, I was mentioning that census data doesn't necessarily have the granularity, and the way that we get around that is to have qualitative data, understanding the experiences that people are living. So it's not a specific answer to like the places that have done it well or haven't, but it is kind of a way forward to improving that situation.
Well, maybe a follow-up question. What about the town hall problem, where you do an engagement activity, whatever that engagement activity might be, and you're sampling on those who have the time and the resources to make their voices heard? What comment would you offer to how to mitigate or take into account that challenge?
I think part of the reason why, like one of the uses for a town hall is when there is a long range plan, or there is a project that you want to receive feedback on, or you want to present to the community, or you want to kind of initiate the conversation. So I think that town halls can be useful, but I think in addition to town halls, there needs to be other methods that you're using to talk with the community.
Other perspectives?
Yeah, I can add on a bit to that, and I hope my sound is a little bit better with the headphones. So and just to, can you reference the initial question again, just so that I.
Yeah, the initial question was that last year, or 18 months ago, many cities had to make rapid choices about whether or not or how to close streets and didn't necessarily have time to do as much as they might have wished about considering the whole picture of who and how that would have impact. And the question is, what can we learn from that experience and what might be done better, hopefully not in another pandemic, but when we have other need for rapid changes?
Yeah, I think so this kind of goes back a little bit into my previous response of, a lot of times within the field of like transportation and planning, we want to move projects along quickly. We want to move things along quick. We want things to, move at a certain pace. And a lot of times when we implement like the timeline of how we want projects to move along, we don't, or there isn't space incorporated for that real, authentic, meaningful community engagement that needs to happen. It can't, as Stefanie was mentioning earlier, having a town hall, that's not enough. I can tell you right, that's not enough, right? Having a town hall and saying, hey, come to this town hall, here's the information on the project. I can tell you from my experience, one town hall is enough. Sometimes two isn't enough. And sometimes the town hall isn't even the right move to make. So it's important to have those lines of communication. That's why I mentioned that, making sure that you're building community first, you're building trust, you're building relationships with the community and the residents and the people that you're looking to serve, so that you can collectively have conversations and find out, what's the best way to share this information with your community and to receive feedback back, right? And, to receive that feedback back. So is it through a community meeting? Is it through, attending an event that may already be happening? Is it through, sharing out some information, surveys, etc.? Talking with community members, finding out the best way to engage with them, working collectively to do that engagement, and really allocating the right amount of time. Because like I mentioned before, there's a lot of mistrust that happens. And so sometimes, you can have the best intentions, but when you come into a community and they know, hey, you're coming to me talking about this, bike lane project or this quick build project as a result of the pandemic, but we're dealing with loss of jobs. We're dealing with healthcare concerns. We're dealing with limited access to transportation as a whole. How can we talk about everything that fits into the built environment, and how can we collectively, work together to strategize a plan moving forward, and making sure that we implement enough time. And that may not work well within, the idea of a quick build project, but if you want to do something right, it's about, do we want to do it right, or do we just want to do it? And I will tell you from experience, it's better to take the time to do the engagement and do the project effectively than having to go back because you've done it wrong. So
Let's turn our attention from the cities to everybody else as well. And I see in our attendees list, we've got a lot of private companies as well who work on dockless, curb management, AVs, lots of folks here. Where's the line between public and private responsibility for considering equity? How should those groups work together? Because sometimes in our discussion so far, we've been talking about what the public officials should be doing, but there are also others who are part of the mobility system. What are their responsibilities, and what should our expectations be for them? Are they different? Are they lesser, greater? Go ahead.
I would say that the public sector has a responsibility to every user, every person who lives within their jurisdiction and uses their services. That means every person of every ability, every language being spoken, those people are being serviced by the public sector. The private sector comes in when, as the private sector, while not required to provide for every user, still needs to provide things like data for using the public streets and public curbs and public spaces. And so it's kind of the cost of doing business in the location is sharing data, and that's not just for data's sake, and that's not just for anti-competitiveness. It's because sharing data with the city so that during emergency situations, of which we see so many, we can activate all possible opportunities for people to get out of where they are so that we can accommodate a loss of service, for example, through flooding, or if a zone needs to be evacuated. We need to be able to tap into every resource possible. And that's a key reason that private sector should be sharing data with the public sector, on top of everyday management of how people are moving and living in a city.
Well, if data is flowing one way, what are the roles of fees or subsidies flowing the other way, if any? You know, if we're talking about a lot of externalities in the system, does the public sector have a obligation and opportunity to help correct some of those externalities?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of how the public-private partnership plays out, that there's a give and take here, with where each side provides kind of subsidies and data, and it's at this point it's been kind of one way for each.
I just want to agree with Sarah that there's a responsibility on the public side, but I think that if you on the private side and are providing transportation services, that there needs to be a recognition of transportation's inequitable past, and then the potential that you as a transportation provider have to improve that situation. So I think that there's it's not the same responsibility, it's not the same requirement, but it's definitely a recognition that has to happen. And in order to kind of be a good steward of the transportation system, it would behoove private sector actors to also work to improve equity.
How do we weigh different dimensions of equity? So, Stefanie, I know some of your work has been a lot about climate and climate justice in the transportation system. How might you weigh, or how might you propose to the audience to think about considering different kinds of equity goals and considering how they might have to prioritize amongst those? Or is that a false choice?
I might ask for a little bit of clarity. So different types of equity goals, do you mean like environmental equity? Do you mean like access? I guess what are they?
Yeah, I guess to take a step back, we might have a program operator or an authority that has finite resources. They have finite people, finite dollars, finite time, and there's a lot of historical things that might need remedy. And how should they determine how to prioritize some of those problems to solve?
Yeah. I think it's going to be different for each community. I feel like we keep going back to this, you know, you have to talk to the community and understand what their needs are, but that's the case, right? So if you need to prioritize what you're going to provide, you should know what the community's priorities are and what they're looking to address and what their biggest challenges are. And in that way, it's not the person who is providing the service or the person who's planning for the service that's going to be planning at or to the community, but the community is saying, these are our priorities. We need these things solved first, and then you are fine. And that also like instills the trust that Waffiyyah was talking about, like working with them to understand what they need and then providing that for them, then allows, you know, for the next improvement, you know, maybe there's something that the planner or provider might think would be great, and maybe now there's more trust built to like, well, let's see how this works for the community as well. So.
Well, maybe Waffiyyah, a question for you. What are the important things that you look to measure, or that you wish you could measure, that would better help you to ensure equitable program operations?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think so the big piece is figuring out what you should be measuring. And making sure that you're measuring it accurately, which goes with, like, you know, so I work in the bike share industry. So for us, we really work to incorporate equity metrics that work to meet the needs of, you know, the most underserved or underrepresented groups. So often, you know, prioritizing the needs of BIPOC communities, individuals with lower income, etc.
So if that's how, we're prioritizing defining equity, our metrics should, be around how are we engaging, folks with different demographic makeup? How are we making sure that we have, ridership in these communities, that we're prioritizing? How are we building to implement programming to help address some of the barriers that may hinder certain communities or certain individuals from participating or using the system effectively? Are we making sure that we develop payment schedules and payment systems that are flexible, and et cetera? So building out, those programs that we're building to help alleviate some of the potential barriers, measuring the success of those programs, measuring the ridership, et cetera. But I think it's also something important to understand is that there's also certain things that you can't always measure, or the data doesn't always tell us everything, right? So it's also important to, have those conversations with the community and talk with them about, how are things going? How's the system coming along? How are you feeling about this? How are you riding? How are you doing that? So that there's gaps that the data doesn't always tell us. There's those community human interactions that the idea, even if a person doesn't necessarily become a monthly rider or an everyday rider, if they go from biking and bike share isn't for me to say, oh, okay, maybe this is something for me that I can incorporate once in a while, but maybe not all the time. That's something that still should be measured. And that's a step forward that you should still be measuring and track and building towards. So I hope that answers the question, but.
Well, a broader question here, I think that comes up from your comment is, how do we take equity out of this silo, right? We're here, we're talking about it, but it's part of everything. And maybe a jumping off point for that is, how do we think about the relationship between safety, which I think a lot of transportation organizations will say is the top goal, and equity? And maybe, Sarah, I'll pose that question to you because I know a lot of your research has touched on that subject, but anybody else, please feel free to chime in. And how should we think about that relationship, or how should we think about the relationship of equity and all other programming in general?
Yeah, so the kind of most obvious answer is if you look at who's using a system and it's not representative of the city's population in general, you can see that there is clearly a disconnect. For example, here in New York, city bike trips are taken, 75% of city bike trips are taken by men. And that's self-reported gender. And that hasn't changed much since the system launched in 2013. So we have a lot of data on this. So clearly, the city is not 75% male, right? And so it points out a problem. And I think with any service, you can see kind of glaring differences in usage that points to an issue that it's not servicing certain groups. This has been recorded in San Francisco, somewhat similar numbers, and I'm sure Waffiyyah can talk about Philadelphia with some great information. I did want to add that one other aspect that I have looked at a lot is women's safety on public transportation. And so women overwhelmingly feel unsafe or experience harassment or assault on public transportation. And those numbers are often much worse for women of color, women who are disabled, and trans women. And so these experiences lead women who can afford to take alternative modes of transportation like taxis or Ubers, which may or may not necessarily be safer, but there is a financial cost and an emotional cost for this experience. And clearly it's not offering an equitable service to many of the public transit users. So safety plays into this discussion. Although I know it can be seen as tangential, but it all falls into the undercurrent of, if a system isn't serving all of its users, and if they don't feel safe using the system, then it's not an equitable system.
Anyone else want to jump in there?
Yeah, I'll just thank you, Sarah, for for sharing those thoughts, especially about, you know, females and et cetera, when using transit. I think the thing for that is it's important to understand that there are multiple definitions of safety. You know, there's the physical safety of making sure that, you know, that you're putting in the proper or safe bike infrastructure to help people feel safe, et cetera, different modes on the road. But then there's also that personal safety aspect that is often not prioritized or not thought about. And that plays a lot into someone's decision to use a specific mode or not use a mode. So rather it's, you know, people of a certain women or et cetera, different genders feeling comfortable, you know, using transportation. Rather, you know, it's a person of color who feels like, you know, I don't want to be racially profiled because I'm using this biking or I'm biking in this area. So there's a lot of different, you know, there's a broad, the definition of safety is very broad. And it's important that, you know, when you're looking to address it, that you're making sure that you're addressing the different aspects of safety and not just necessarily, you know, the actual infrastructure pieces. That, not that they aren't important, because they do play a role, but there's other pieces of the personal safety and other, you know, things that need to be addressed and thought about.
And I'm going to take my response in just a slightly different direction, and kind of talk about a reframing of how we talk about equity analyses. So a lot of what we do is typically say, well, who are the people that we're concerned about, and where are they? And let's put them on a map and let's draw some lines and say these are the equity areas. And then from there, we're saying, well, you know, what's their experience for safety? How many scooters are we deploying in these areas? And what are our investment dollars in these areas? But I think that to get to the point where, you know, equity is ingrained within all we're doing, if we can switch it and think about, well, where are the areas of disadvantage for our transportation system? Where are the areas that are unsafe? Where are the areas where we don't have options, transportation options, and who lives there? And are the people who live there different than the people who live in the areas that do have lots of options that are more safe? And what are the differences in the quantitative ways that we can measure the difference between those areas and the people who experience transportation in those areas and the people who experience transportation in areas that are more advantaged? And doing it that way, we're able to look at whatever the impact is, whether it's accessibility, whether it's safety, whether it's investment dollars. We're able to look at the broad range of all things we're planning for and all the outcomes and how they impact different populations and different communities that we're concerned about. So I think a bit of reframing of how we're analyzing equity is necessary, and starting at well, where are the limitations of the transportation system and who's experiencing those, and how are those experiences different between different populations and across different communities?
And Sarah, maybe the most striking part of that city bike analysis was just that it's been pretty stable over time, with the exception of the Brooklyn, the expansion program, which had different figures. What would we conclude, or what would you conclude, what would you comment maybe, about the fact that we've known these things for a while, but then they don't change? What does that mean?
Right. So, well, first of all, the city bike numbers changed a bit when during the pandemic, frontline workers were offered free city bike memberships, and women enrolled at much higher rates than men. And we know that frontline workers are majority women, and so so it's kind of proportional to the enrollment. But women were traveling on city bike a lot more when they had these free memberships. So I think that it's clear that, first of all, cost is a major barrier. You know, the cost of using bike share on top of, say, a Metro card. You know, in New York, we don't have an aligned payment system for these different modes, which is really harmful to a lot of people. And then, but what the larger discussion points out is that we need better street infrastructure to ensure people's safety, because in surveying, a lot of women reported that they don't feel safe biking on city streets, and so that points out a lack of infrastructure. But with respect to what my co-panelists said, it's also an issue of people not feeling safe biking through certain areas, you know, because they might not feel like they fit in there or belong there. Although I haven't looked at that in detail, but but it is a good point that I don't want to ignore.
Well, let's shift now to a couple of audience questions. There are several which came in all along kind of a similar theme around engagement and how cities should do that, what their relationship should be with private companies, and how it could all be done better. And while we go over some of those, if folks have more questions, please submit them in the Q&A and we will try to get to them. So a first question here was asking, can you talk a bit about engagement beyond town halls? So what are the things that people should be doing beyond town halls? And when doing those activities, how do we know if they're working? If anyone wants to jump in, not everyone has to answer, but glad to have one victim.
I can I can definitely answer that. So there's a variety of things. I mean, I can share some of the techniques that we've used, but as I've mentioned and as we've heard a lot throughout this time, it's important to have those conversations with the specific community that you're looking to serve, because not everyone isn't the same, right? Every community, every resident, every person isn't the same, and you have to make sure that you're working with them to find out what's the best way to connect with that community. So for instance, something with us, so we've done community meetings where we schedule something at like the space within the community. I think that's the piece. So aside from the actual meeting, is making sure that you're having it in a location that is easily accessible to the residents or the community that you're looking to engage. Like me holding a meeting at City Hall downtown, how is that helpful if I'm inviting people from a specific community? I want to hold the meeting in that community in a space where they feel comfortable and they can easily get to. We've done surveys. We've also done something recently that we implemented, which came from a suggestion from some of our community partners, that we created like these door knob hangers where it would have information about, the bike share system. We're looking to expand in your area. We want to get your feedback on, where you think a bike share system should go. So we created these door knockers that we hung on doors throughout the community so that people could look at those and, find out information on how to share back feedback to us. We've done attended smaller, large community events to help get feedback on site at events. We had one-on-one conversations, attended meetings that were already in place. So surveys, etc. So those are just a few things that we've implemented. But as I mentioned, we implemented those things with the community. So we don't do all of them in every area because they may not work well for every area, but we talk and see what's the best course of action, especially, given the recent pandemic. And we know you had to shift up and switch the way you do engagement. It was really important to have those conversations and see the best way to engage.
Well, there are two questions that came in that get to the heart of what a lot of the OMF often asks about, which are, how can we make these things really data-driven? And one questioner asks, are there examples or are there suggestions for how permission to operate in a city should be tied to specific measurable outcomes for a commercial provider? And then another user asks, what are strategies for actually measuring those outcomes while being sensitive to what data is being collected? So interested in reactions to the panelists kind of to those two questions together, which is, how do we put teeth to some of these goals, but then how do we be sensitive about that while we do it? Sarah or Stefanie, if you are with you.
Yeah, I can start also. I would say yes, you definitely want to put in, some concrete deliverables, some concrete measurements around how you're assessing the work of equity, and making sure that there are standard service levels or obligations that a service provider has around measured equity, because understanding they want to come into the city, to the community, and they want to offer a service. So making sure that you provide regulations to make sure that the service that they're offering does meet the needs of the community and the city as a whole. So I know there's, you can have some requirements around making sure that you have you know, a certain amount of vehicles or equipment distributed through neighborhoods evenly, or distributed through neighborhoods throughout different times or different days, making sure that you're doing community engagement, whether it's the operator doing community engagement themselves, which isn't, you know, I know sometimes, and this kind of goes back to the earlier question of like, whose role is it to do community engagement? Is it the role of the city? Is it the role of the operator? In my experience, in my opinion, is everyone should play a role in the community engagement. Everyone should play a role in the conversation, because it's important for the community to know who's involved, right? Who's involved in this system. It's not just, you know, it's not just the city, it's also the operator, it's also this person who's doing the community engagement. So everyone should play a role in it. So the community should be aware of who the partners or who the players are. So I think, you know, definitely having those required measurements and required tasks around equitable access from the beginning, and building ways to measure that and measure success. And you can tie it to the amount of vehicles that you want to put out at the time, or, you know, whatever, different situations. But I would say, yes, it should definitely be implemented and thought about.
I think Waffiyyah mentioned one of the metrics that are typically used, and that's deployment in particular areas, and kind of more equal deployment across a city or a jurisdiction. I think another metric that has been used, and I think the way that it's used can be improved, is if there are equity or access programs that are provided by the company to encourage and support low-income riders and other community members who may not interact with these types of transportation services frequently, to get them involved and to provide support for them to also be riders. So I think that there's a requirement that there are these programs, but how these programs grow and how they develop in kind of what the outcome is, I think that that's something that's not necessarily measured effectively. And what I mean by effectively is whether it's, you know, deemed a success, but then also if it's allowing the companies and the city to see the benefits that they want to see, where there is increased ridership amongst populations that need additional transportation options. The other thing that I'll say is, I think looking at, you know, a scooter or an individual mobility service separately from the entire transportation system is a part of the problem. So if we're saying we need to deploy scooters across the whole city, maybe there are parts of the city that don't need scooter deployment, they need other options. So I think that we need to really think about how these mobility services fit within the whole package of our transportation services and system, and finding ways to have those measurements a part of our broader transportation performance management system or program.
Stefanie, let me build on that with another question for you from panelists, or sorry, from the audience. There are two questions which both ask kind of that point. Are we looking too small, and are asking about land use? So one of the reasons why transportation systems might be deficient is if the land use policies have led to a challenge to serve a certain area. So one questioner asks, can we talk more about the intersection of land use and zoning with equitable transportation? And another question was about what are the changes that might be coming or might be experienced in the last year from people leaving cities or moving out of the cities to suburbs or to rural areas. So maybe on both those fronts, if we think outside the vehicle, maybe think outside the paint and the concrete, and think about the whole city, what are the obligations or responsibilities there? What are the opportunities?
Yeah, and I think this goes a little bit back to what I was saying about identifying areas where there are transportation deficiencies before trying to before trying to understand different populations and how they're experiencing it. Because if we do identify that there are areas that are transportation deficient, maybe it's the needs that they have are not for scooters, but maybe it's for additional, maybe it's a car sharing service instead. So maybe it's an industrial land use, so it doesn't make sense to have, you know, a bike lane without having it be protected, or like, so there are things that we need to consider when we're talking about providing equitable service, because it's going to change depending on where we are in the city based on land use. In terms of kind of demographic shifts and people moving in and out of the city or in and out of different neighborhoods, I don't have a solution for this, but I do want to also kind of point to the need to supplement any kind of quantitative analysis we're doing with some qualitative research, because as I mentioned, the census data is where we're getting our demographic data, and that's being updated maybe every 5 years. If we're talking about kind of at a block group level, we can probably say this update every 5 years, and that's going to be we're not going to be able to catch demographic shifts as they're happening if we're kind of waiting at that timeline. So I don't have a solution, but I will say that part of the solution is making sure that we're checking with the community and seeing kind of their experience in terms of demographic shifts.
Well, there's an interesting question that came up related to that, which was, what are unintended consequences of reliance on data or tying data and outcomes together? And how might we prevent or mitigate these? Thoughts on the panel from that? Sarah, I see your head nodding.
Yeah, so often there's confirmation bias in the data, right? So we're looking to find something and then we find it. And so I know, Stefanie, you worked on the Changing Lanes report. I had a small role in it as well, but one of the findings can be attributed to basically a lack of car ownership in one neighborhood in Los Angeles was detrimental to the local population because that was their major source of mobility. And so car shares were placed in the neighborhood, but then in this report, it was found that in the neighborhood, women have fewer driver's licenses, or fewer women have driver's licenses in this neighborhood. And so a car share isn't very helpful if they can't make use of it. And so going back to what Stefanie had said about digging deeper in the data is key in how we actually make use of it.
Great. I think we have time for one last audience question, and then we want to close up with some recommendations for everybody listening. So here's the last challenging question, maybe the hardest question, which is how to manage political forces, in particular, literally the elected officials. And one questioner asks, what are strategies that staff level planners can use to overcome the challenges when city council or mayoral administrations may oppose changes due to the political risks associated with it? Is there, and I'll add on to this by saying, is there a role for data? Are there cautions that we'd have when thinking about data in managing the staff versus political divide that can sometimes exist in cities?
I can add something there. So I think, yeah, data is good to be able to have. I would say it's good to be able to have as much information as you can to back up what it is that you're proposing. So if there's data that backs up your theory, that's great. I will say also in our experiences, a lot of, elected officials, they're voted in by the residents, by the constituents. So if you have, a track record of, or, information showing that residents or community members are for a specific idea that you're looking to implement, that goes a long way with trying to persuade, the council person or an elected person within their district. So that's why it's always good to have that community engagement and have those relationships already built, so that when you do come across possible issues, like maybe with an elected official or someone else, you can go and reach out to those community partners and those relationships that you built and show like, hey, we've been working with these partners. They're on board for this particular project or this particular program. And so use that as support for trying to sway some elected officials.
Excellent. Well, let me ask the panelists to help us close out now with two questions for them. Number one, what's one thing that you'd like this audience to read or watch or listen to, if there's anything that you think that would be generative for them and for everybody following all in the conversation? And then secondly, what should they be doing besides just reading or watching or following along? Maybe a phrasing is, if we came together in 1 year from now, what would you hope that they have done?
Well, I'll start off. And so I'm going to focus primarily on the latter question, but we talked a lot about qualitative data and engagement, but I do want to kind of put a bow on some like ideas for quantitative analysis. And that is, I hope that in a year from now, we know that there are disparities. We kind of work a lot to say there are disparities, but and moving past identifying disparities, if we're able to measure and monitor and improve the conditions between those who are burdened and those who are benefited. And that looks like, continual evaluation. So determining what the current baseline is and then establishing plans that actually track the progress that we're making. And then gauging our analysis, not just on averages, but on the real, like the spectrum of differences, the distribution of impacts that people are facing. And one thing I think we can do that we don't tend to do is disaggregating populations. So instead of kind of creating an index of, populations of concern, we're looking at individual populations that have different and distinct challenges. So generally just recognizing that there's a full story that's not going to be shown in our desktop analysis, and that we need to kind of dig deeper, and that we're not trying to answer the question, is this equitable, but really get information to improve our transportation system.
I would say two things that if you haven't already read or looked into that I would recommend is Charles Brown's work around arrest and mobility. I would definitely recommend taking a look into that, especially if you're doing any of this work. Also, the Untokening principles around for mobility justice is also a great guide as well. That should be used to steer people and guide people that are doing this work, especially if you're working around community engagement and so forth. Things that I would hope that people really take from this and implement is definitely making sure that you're really prioritizing the work of equity and not just saying that you're prioritizing it. Equity, community engagement, outreach, it unfortunately becomes very much a buzzword. And, people implement it and write it in because we have to put it in, right? We have to prioritize equity in order to get this grant. We have to prioritize equity in order to get this funding. And it's a thing that oftentimes people do it because they have to do it or because it's become a buzz or a trend, but really taking the time to really research and understand what it means to incorporate equity and access into what it really means to do meaningful community engagement so that you're doing it. Because if you try to do this work and you're not fully committed to it, you don't have an understanding of it, you're doing a disservice not only to yourselves, but also to the residents and the community that you are looking to serve. So I would say take the time to do your research, have those, often difficult conversations, but the conversations that need to be had about this work. So, yeah.
Sarah, you have the last word?
I'll go quickly. I know we're running short on time, but something to read is Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Math Destruction, and it's how data is used to manipulate policy goals. And if you don't have the patience for the book, there's a great TED Talk as well. That's my recommendation. And in a year, I would like to see OMF and members push for more regional sharing of data as we continue to have emergencies, whether they're public health or climate related. We need to make sure that people can get around and be safe. and people need options. And the best way we can provide most possible options is by sharing data on a regional level. And so I'd like to see that.
Excellent. Angela, to you for the next steps for the OMF.
Thank you so much. So many great points, such a great conversation. Thank you to all of our panelists. Thank you to all the attendees. One of the things that I kind of hope to see is some of this conversation, as many of you had mentioned, really reflected in the outcomes, right? Not just putting a kind of goal out there, but really making sure that our resources, our goals, our outcomes, that they all align in more and more meaningful ways. So, you know, and on the topic of community engagement, the OMF itself is a community. The data standards that we build are open source, which basically means they are built by our community, by our volunteers. So highly encourage you to check out our website. There's a page all about how to participate. There's a lot of other resources too about privacy, not an area that we were able to kind of dig into more deeply, but we have resources for cities on how to make kind of critical privacy considerations, particularly as it relates to MDS, which is the data standard that we steward. But really looking forward to having a more conversation, and I will be sending around the recording of this as soon as it's available, as well as some other resources. So thank you again, and have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.
Take
Bye,
care.
folks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.